Okay, colleagues, hello and welcome back. Now, in the last lecture, I tried to introduce the concept of naturalism. And I have talked about the three approaches, basically. The synchronic, the diachronic, and the phenomenological. Now, let me try to explain what I mean by these words. So, these, in some sense, are the three ways in which one could approach the idea of naturalism. Now, in some sense, what I'm driving at is that these would be the three ways in which one would become a naturalist. So if you want, these would be the three roads to naturalism. And what I'm trying to say is that these roads, broadly speaking, point in the same direction. However, because our science is not finished yet, the roads are not finished yet. They point in the same direction, which is not to say that they converge on the same point, on the same exact location. So in a deep sense, these three ways, I think they offer us some ways to think about naturalism, and they also provide a basic plausibility argument as to why naturalist worldview makes sense. But that is not to say that we have the naturalist worldview all figured out. That is still a work in progress. So again, diachronic, synchronic, phenomenological. To oversimplify, let's use simpler terms. Diachronic means historical, synchronic means something like structural, and phenomenological is the approach that is based on our personal experience of ourselves. So to speak, first-person experience from inside of our own head. So what I'm trying to say is that, first of all, you can look historically as to how naturalism first appeared in something like ancient Greece, and then gradually grew over time, and then naturalist worldview, broadly speaking, acquired the dominant position, more or less since the scientific revolution in, roughly speaking, 16th century. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these are general directions, not completely plotted out paths. We haven't yet seen the end of naturalism. We don't yet have the complete naturalist picture of the world. And so I can only point to this general progression. Like in and of itself, this progression does not guarantee that naturalism is the final answer. And in fact, none of the three approaches actually guarantees that naturalism is the final answer. But I want to say that something like the balance of evidence points to naturalism as the best alternative that we are faced with today. So again, the first, the diachronic or the historical path, shows this progression, shows this growth of interest, and even if you want, growth of faith in the naturalistic methodology. So the first approach, in some sense, takes us from Thales to Hawking, if you want. Like history of naturalism from Thales to Hawking. The second approach, the synchronic or the structural approach, takes us from protons to precedents. So this is the approach that looks at this ladder of sciences, if you want, this idea of the unity of science, how psychology is based on biology, biology is based on chemistry, chemistry is based on physics, and there is this natural logical progression, logical hierarchy among the sciences. So to try to be as explicit and maybe a little bit colloquial, one way that a person might become a naturalist is by looking at the history of science and deciding, well, yeah, I see this progression, so probably in the end we will all become naturalists. The second way is to examine the sciences in themselves, and even though no particular science gives us the full picture, but still, from the interplay, from the interaction of sciences with each other, you can see certain naturalist presuppositions emerging. And then I want to talk about the third approach, which is phenomenological. So again, the first one, historical or diachronic, is we study the history of science. The second, structural or synchronic, we study the logic of science in 2020. First one is from Thales to Hawking. Second one is from protons to precedents. And the phenomenological approach is, so to speak, from your mind with your eyes closed to the world outside. The third approach, and I tried to explicate that a little bit in the lecture, demonstrates to us that if we pay attention, pay close attention to our experience, and I could refer to thinkers such as Martin Heidegger and Sigmund Freud. So if we examine our experience closely, we find that we are standing as if at the end of a certain dark tunnel, And from these dark tunnel, we get all sorts of beliefs, values, desires. I mean, we are born with a certain body, with certain desires, with certain needs, with certain dispositions. We are also socialized into a society with certain values. So we can see ourselves as products of something larger than ourselves. The reason I bring this up is because on the Cartesian picture of the subject, naturalism is highly implausible. The Cartesian worldview does not talk about one world, it talks about two worlds, the dualism of mind and body. And on the Cartesian worldview, it is not clear how the human soul is supposed to fit into this material world. Whereas what I want to say is that if we look closely at our experience with the help of people like Heidegger and Freud, we naturally would expect to find something like the naturalist picture. Again, I am born with certain dispositions. Where do these dispositions come from? Let's say, according to ancient Greek mythology, humans were made by Prometheus, at least in one version. So was it Prometheus who has pre-programmed my body to be averse to, let's say, rotting meat, to be disgusted by rotting meat? So phenomenology by itself does not tell us what we were pre-programmed by, but it alerts our attention to the fact that we are pre-programmed by something over and above ourselves. And so phenomenology points to this, if you want, using William Golding's metaphor, this dark tunnel at the back of the head. And the key question is, what do we find on the other side of this dark tunnel? Phenomenology cannot tell us. By closing my eyes, I cannot go through this dark tunnel. I need to open my eyes and I need to ask the scientists, I need to ask the psychologists and the biologists and the sociologists, why do I have the dispositions that I do? And the answer, broadly speaking, goes something like this. Human beings are anxious and mostly unconscious products of larger forces, of biological and cultural evolution, manufactured by these forces, not to be happy, but to fulfill a certain function in the perpetuation of the logic of these systems of biological and cultural evolution. And somebody like Freud or Heidegger would also add that we want things that we do not really need, but the things that we truly need, we can never really get. We'll have an occasion to explicate these phrases a bit further, but the idea I'm driving at is that on the evolutionary picture, which cannot be established through phenomenology, but which is uniquely corroborated by phenomenology, at least in my opinion. So on the evolutionary picture, we are products of this process of biological and cultural natural selection. Our beliefs, values, desires, to a very large extent, are products of that process. We come pre-programmed into this world. And we do not know the reasons behind the programs that we find ourselves with. At least we do not know them immediately. So in order to find out the reasons for these programs, we need to turn to biology. First and foremost, evolutionary biology, and if you want, as a subfield of that, evolutionary psychology. What is the evolution of the human mind? And the ultimate answer that evolution gives us is deeply unsettling, because there's nothing meaningful or purposeful in evolution. Evolution is not going anywhere in particular. Evolution is just a blind, deterministic process which has its origin, its ultimate origin, in random mutations. So if you want, in seeking the meaning of our life, in going through this dark tunnel at the back of the head, we find not meaning but meaninglessness, not purpose but randomness. And again, as I keep repeating, how do we reconcile these two? How do we reconcile the account of ourselves as free, rational, meaningful agents and our account of basic reality as made up of meaningless, mindless particles? How do we reconcile the protons and the precedents? This, I think, is the key intellectual task that faces us today in the 21st century.